for today is Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. This verse is in the context of the Apostle Paul giving us evidence that men are guilty before God. If you remember, when we looked at the beginning of the context, the Apostle Paul told us in verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes." Then in verse 17 he says, "It is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith." He's building an argument because each time he uses this word for. In verse 16, he's actually explaining what he said before, that he is ready to preach the gospel. The reason why he's ready is because he's not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God to save everyone who believes. And then he says the reason why it is the power of God to everyone who believes is, again, verse 17, because it is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. What makes it the power of God is that it gives unrighteous men righteousness that they so desperately need. But the reason why the gospel is so essential, and the reason why it is so important that men receive the righteousness of God, is the next verse, verse 18, which says, again, for, or because, that's the Greek word gar, the wrath of God is constantly being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness of men. So that would make the gospel absolutely essential and urgent for men to hear, because they need the righteousness of God for their sins to be forgiven and for them to be made right with God, because they are unrighteous and ungodly. But the Bible tells us that these same men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. It is the reality that they know the truth, but they suppress the truth. Now, Paul's going to build this argument now. In verse 19, he says, because, now this is a different word, not gar, but as I told you last time, this is the word dioti, and it's the word that builds an argument or gives cause for what he just said. There's a second one down in verse 21, which we will look at next time. But for today, he begins to build his argument by saying that these men suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and ultimately they are deserving of the wrath of God, because what may be known of God, or what is knowable of God, is clear or made plain to them. The reason why is verse 19, for God has shown it to them. Well, we would ask the question, how is it that God has shown it to them? Well, that takes us to our verse today, verse 20. Begins with the word for, and for is explaining what he just said. How is it that God has shown it to them? How is it that men have known about God? Well, Romans 1:20 says that the creation of the world has put him on display. So let's look at the text. He says, for since the creation of the world. Now, some translations say from as this word since. It comes from the Greek word apo. The literal rendering of that word would be from. But you notice in the translation I have, which is the New King James, it translates it since. It's not actually the word for since, but it is indeed a word that is translated from. Now, there's a reason for this, is because some scholars disagree as to whether this is referring to a from in the sense of source, or is this a from in the sense of time. What I mean by that is this: for since the creation of the world, or could we read it this way, from the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. In other words, from the source of creation. That's where it comes from. From creation, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Or from the sense of time, from since creation began, when God created everything, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Well, based upon the evidence that I have found, it seems best to understand that this verse is referring to the word apo in the sense of time. So it would be good to translate it for since the creation of the world. In other words, from the very beginning when God created everything. The word "the" is not in the text. There's only one creation, the creation at the very beginning, as Genesis 1:1 talks about. So there's not multiple creations, and there doesn't need to be the distinction with the definite article "the." So nevertheless, just for the reading of the text, from the creation of the world, or since the beginning of creation, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Now, the word for attributes is actually not there. It's assumed by the word invisible. The word invisible comes from a Greek word, aoratos. And the word aoratos comes from two words, the word horao, and that word means to see, but then there's an alpha or an A in front of it, makes it not able to see or not seen, or hence invisible. And this word is used over in Colossians 1:15 and also 1 Timothy 1:17 to refer to the invisible God. In fact, that is the idea, that this invisible unseen of God, and by the way, it is plural, the invisible things of God are clearly seen. So a way of reading that is the unseen is clearly seen. And the word translated here, clearly seen, is a present tense verb, which means it is continually seen. The word translated seen here, or clearly seen, is the Greek word katahorao. And the word katahorao is the same word we saw over here with horao with an alpha in front of it, but this one's horao with kata in front of it. And the word kata means down, and the word horao means to look or to see. The idea is to look down on from a vantage point. The point is clear perception, clear vision, unhindered perception. And so what Paul is arguing for here is from the very beginning of time, since creation began, the invisible things about God that are not able to be seen are clearly being seen. They are clearly in view. He goes on to even amplify that more by saying that these things are being understood. The word being understood is a participle. It's a present participle, which means it is constantly being understood. This participle modifies the invisible. These invisible things are the things that are being understood. The Greek word understood is the word noeo. And the idea is to consider or to realize. In fact, one commentator said that this understanding, this rational thinking understanding, is the foundation of our moral culpability. The point is that man is created with reason, man is created with thinking capacity, man is created with the understanding, and he sees what God has created in the text right here since the very beginning. And in that seeing of those things, he sees the invisible attributes of God, and they are understood by the things that are made, as he says. That Greek word is poema, and the word poema means the works of God. It is translated one other time over in Ephesians 2:10 that refers to the workmanship of God. It's actually looking at it like this, that the things that are made in the sense of God's great handiwork, the complete project of God's creation, all that there is that God has made, is a constant testimony that is clearly seen, so much so that men understand his invisible attributes. Those invisible things that Paul brought up in the earlier part of the verse are now clearly said in the next few words. He says, even his eternal power and Godhead. Two things are mentioned here. In fact, the word translated here, even, is the Greek word te. Te means both his eternal power and Godhead. This term eternal is only used one other time in the New Testament in Jude verse 6. And also the term translated here Godhead is only used once right here in Romans chapter 1 verse 20. And commentators tell us that the reason why that is Paul is using some of the Greek vocabulary that was common among the Hellenistic Jews, the Greek-speaking Jews, and the Greek society. Although not commonly used in his own personal writings, he's appealing to the Gentile community and the Greek community with words that they were formerly acquainted with. So here in this text, he says that God is making himself known, that is, his invisible attributes. The unseen things are clearly seen and completely understood by the things that are his completed work, even his eternal power. Now, the word power is the word dunamis in the Greek. We get dynamite from it. It simply means the power, the creative power of God, the eternal power of God. The word eternal has the idea of unending, continuous duration, unceasing. And then the word Godhead, very interesting word. The Greek word is the word theotes. And the word theotes is a word that means divine nature, or as some translations have given it, divinity. And rightly said, it refers to the characteristics of God. Hence, that's where we get this word attributes up here from. So we're talking about God's eternal power and his Godhead. You see, in creation, the very power of God cannot be explained any other way. In fact, as you look at the word created up here, I didn't point this out, but the word creation, it comes from a Greek word ktisis, and it means to create from nothing. The same idea is communicated in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where it says that in the beginning God created. The word created there is the Hebrew word bara, and the word bara means to create out of nothing. That's called ex nihilo. It means that God didn't go down to the nearest store and gather together his supplies to create everything. He literally, according to the text of Scripture, spoke it into existence. It did not exist at one time, and then he spoke and it did exist. He created out of nothing. That is the reference to his eternal power. This creation of God is not something simple, but it is something very powerful. And then the second point is, Paul says, that it is a display of his Godhead. That is his divinity. All of his characteristics, the grace, the mercy, the love, the benevolence, the long-suffering, all of those characteristics, sovereignty, power, all of those are there, and many more that are shown just by the creation itself. So this display that God has given to us, it tells us in this text, leaves men without excuse. The word here translated without excuse is the word anapologetos. We get the word apologetics from it, but in this text it means there's no apologetic. In other words, there's no defense, no convincing argument. And the point is, men are without excuse because they have clearly seen the invisible things of God by the things that are made, so that they are without excuse. This last phrase here, translated so they are without excuse, is what Greek scholars call an articular infinitive. It can mean result or it can mean purposeful result. And the difference would simply be this: that God has so created everything, and men clearly see God's invisible attributes or invisible characteristics because of this creation, with the result, so people are without excuse. Or it may also suggest purpose, meaning that so that people would be without excuse. As one early church father stated, it's not that God created everything for the purpose so that he could make men without excuse, but rather he created everything to glorify himself so that men would know who God is. The reason why men are without excuse is because they have suppressed the truth that this text says is clearly seen. John MacArthur wrote these words: "Random noise could never produce a Bach cantata. Random letters floating in an ocean of alphabet soup will never spell out a chapter from Moby Dick. When we hear the music, we know there was a composer. When we read coherent writings, we know there was an author. How much more does this principle apply to the detailed information contained in the DNA of every living creature?" And that is the word for today.